which SEC fan base doesn't realize their team is about to have a disappointing 2024 football season?
Auburn.
They're delusional.
Look, I don't even think they're gonna have a bad season. It's the fact that they think that they're gonna have this like crazy record of like 10-2, or they're gonna be in the playoff or something. And I'm just like, can y'all be realistic for 1 second? You know who you have at quarterback. Do you know the limitations of your offense? You're having a first-year freshman receiver in Ken Coleman, and you're just asking him to do everything. I think that's part of it. And then I think there are certain spots where they don't have enough depth, especially in that secondary. I'm worried about their secondary a little bit.
Nose
Um,
tackle's not very deep.
yeah, defensive tackle is another spot. Um, I think they're set at running back, but what type of what type of influence is going to have, because it's going to be very dependent on how well the offensive line does this year. Not saying the offensive line was bad last year or anything, but it certainly still needs to keep improving, especially in the running game. I think that was one of the areas that they struggled in. But it all starts with Peyton Thorne, and if he can't move the ball down the field, then I mean that's that.
We said it multiple times. It lives and dies with Peyton Thorne.
The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back, new students to the game. My name is Alex Baumann, and I'm joined by my co-host today, Nathan Glidewell. Football is back this weekend, so we are definitely excited for what's going to be going on. I know it's week 0, and there's not a lot of marquee matchups, but it is college football, and it's good football. We're really excited to see what's going on this season. You have Florida State playing week 0, so there'll be some intrigue there with what DJ Uyunglele looks like with the Seminoles in year 1. Nathan, how excited are you for week 0 of college football?
Well, I kind of just like think back to when I started counting down the days. I think it was right after college basketball ended in April, and I was like, gosh, when is college football? And I think for most people it's like that. And you get into the whole like week 0 games, and you're like, oh, okay, so these aren't like great games, but every single game that you watch, you kind of cherish more because it is the first games of the season. I saw some tweet/X today saying that someone's going to be watching SMU Nevada like it's the Super Bowl, and I'm like, that is basically how every single college football fan is this week. And I think even going into next week, you talked about the Thursday games next week, and just the midweek games. Every single game is just huge for people because you have missed it so much. But as far as like week 0, I mean, having Georgia Tech, Florida State, I know it's at 11 a.m. I know it's in Dublin, Ireland. It's a weird game, but it's still a pretty good game. So but I'm sure people will be up to watch it. I know I will. But as far as like week 0, it's all right. It could be worse.
Can be worse is definitely a good point there. So, as expected with college football starting up this weekend, this is going to be a college football heavy show. We're going to go over this NIT idea the Group of 5 has had, and we got some more lists to go over, Nathan, rankings. I know we've sort of dove into those the past couple of weeks, breaking those down. Really went after Chris Dolering's list last week of the receivers. So we'll have to get into Roman Harper's list this week. So let's start off with this NIT of football discussion they've had, Nathan. Even though the Group of 5 is guaranteed at least one spot in the college football's new 12-team format, commissioners from the conferences are discussing the possibility of a reshaped postseason for their schools, incorporating the bowl system and providing the opportunity to compete in a secondary championship for those not competing in the CFP. The Mountain West commissioner, Gloria Navarez, is who characterized it as the NIT of football. And the reason behind these discussions are that after the 2025 season, there is no set specific format for the final 6 years of the current CFP contract, and the power is in the hands of the Big Ten, SEC, and ESPN, so they could easily tell the Group of 5 to go kick rocks if they wanted to because they have the power. So what are your thoughts on the Group of 5 implementing this NIT of football, Nathan? Are you for it? Are you against it? Are you sort of neutral on it?
Well, first off, I kind of just like look at it from the perspective of a competitor. Let's say I'm a player for one of these Group of 5 teams. I'm thinking, yes, I can compete at the highest level that every single other team is, including the teams from the SEC and the Big Ten, ACC, and so on and so forth. So I think it's kind of disrespectful for people to have to come up with a secondary system for us to play in because they think, well, we're not as good. And I'm sure that there are multiple players in the Group of 5 that are like, okay, we're very good and we can compete with some of these teams. Now, this is going to come from the perspective of someone who has watched football for a while and knows that it is a different brand of football when you talk about the SEC and the Big Ten, some of the teams from there. Obviously, at times it can be top heavy, and there are years where a Group of 5 team can compete with a regular Power 5 team, but this is going to be the best of the best. This is the playoffs. I think back a few years ago when Cincinnati first made the playoffs and they had to play against Alabama. It didn't work out well. And it just, I don't think them being in the playoff really gives them anything to, work for. Obviously, you're going to be guaranteed a spot this season, but after that, it's like you're kicked out. So are you going to continue to work for it? Probably not. So I think there is a point where it's like, yeah, you should have a secondary pool to really choose who was the best Group of 5 team. And I think that will be exciting. But then you look at it from a competitive perspective and you're like, okay, I don't really like the way this is like set up. I think they should change the name because the NIT is kind of disrespectful in a sense.
Yeah, it definitely is disrespectful to label it the NIT of football, especially the aura that the NIT of basketball has. It's like the losers tournament. This is how we characterize it really as fans. Is it's more of where the lesser teams of college basketball go, or the snubs from the college basketball tournament go. But a lot of the time, those snubs just decline those invitations. They don't go. I mean, North Carolina did that a couple of years ago, where they declined to go to the NIT, which I can understand from a coach's perspective. You don't want to, quote unquote, stoop to that level of competition, but I think this would be given a better name than NIT, whether you want to call it the Group of 5 championship or whatever you want to. I think it'd be more beneficial for these athletes to give them a better chance and a better look at what a bowl game or the championship would look like rather than the NIT name. And you kind of touched on it, Nathan, with the competition between the Group of 5 and the Power 4, you want to characterize it as now. It's gotten closer in recent years, but there's still a little bit of a discrepancy. Look at it last year. The highest ranked Group of 5 team would have been Liberty at number 23, and they ended up playing Oregon, and the final score is 45-6. So that would have not looked good in the college football playoff. There would have been a lot of fans saying, well, why did Liberty make it in, and why didn't this team make it in? Why didn't Penn State make it in? They would have put a more fight against Oregon than Liberty would have. And I would have to agree, Penn State probably would have scored more than 6 points against Oregon. But then you look 2 years ago, Tulane plays USC.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
46-45. So it's a coin flip here of whether it's going to be good or bad, really. And the committee, the college football committee, has to make the decision of how they want to do this. Do they want to tell these Group of 5 teams to kick rocks? I don't think that's in their best interest, because you're really segmenting yourselves away from those markets, whether they're big or small. And you're going to move yourself towards an NFL model where you're going to have the NFC and the AFC of college football. You're going to have the Big Ten and the SEC. And whether we like it or not, that looks like the way we're moving towards, is we're going to have 2 mega conferences with the best of the best in them. And I'm not sure if I'm the biggest fan of that. I like seeing the big upsets. I like seeing the App State take down Michigan and all that type of stuff that we've seen in past years. That's what makes college football fun. And seeing the Oregon versus Georgia every year, well, that's great. We're going to miss out on the upsets. We're going to miss out on, tune in, Colorado is beating the running national champions. I mean, it gets people to the game. So while I like the NIT of football idea, the name has to be changed first. But I like the idea, but it's going to have to be put in a way where you're not making yourselves appear as lesser than the competition. You have to compete with the Power Five or Power Four. You have to get yourself in a way that you're still in the room with these conferences, or you're just going to be segmented to lesser than. And I hate to see that for these programs.
Yeah, I think this season with the first 12-team playoff will tell a lot about how the Group 5 can compete, whether they get one team in or maybe we get surprised and let's say the Group 5 is really good and they get two teams in. Let's think how they compete against some of these Power 4 teams. Gosh, that's so weird to say now.
Yeah, I catch myself every time.
But let's say one of these teams gets an upset. I mean, it's totally plausible given the fact that we watched Tulane beat the brakes off USC. Really, I mean that was a game I enjoyed watching thoroughly. So let's say something like that happens. Let's just say they shouldn't be saying, "Hey, we should have more teams in." So we could have a completely different discussion based on how the season goes. But based off of just trends, I would say it would probably be a better opportunity for some of these schools to play in a separate pool.
It definitely would be, but I hate for them to be delegated to that because there's a lot of good talent and a lot of good coaches on these rosters, and to segment them to a secondary championship just seems so distasteful to me because we've seen it in years past. Upsets happen, and I hope this season in the college football playoff, an upset does happen. Just hopefully not to Alabama if they make it, because that would be a whole different issue.
I don't think anyone would enjoy that. I mean, anyone here, I'm sure everyone else would, but
Gray probably would if he was here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about these lists that Roman Harper released, Nathan. Starting with the top 10 quarterbacks, SEC quarterbacks of the past decade. I'll read them off the top 10 to everybody. Number 1 was Joe Burrow. 2, Jaden Daniels. 3, Tua Tagovailoa. 4, Dak Prescott. 5, Bryce Young. 6, Stetson Bennett. 7, Jalen Hurts. 8, Jake Fromm. 9, Hendon Hooker. And then 10, Mac Jones. At what point did I lose you in that top 10, Nathan?
Stetson Bennett was mentioned.
Even though he won 2 national championships and was 4th in the Heisman?
This is Stetson Bennett we're talking about. I watched him have one of the best. He played with some of the most talented roster I had ever seen, and he really benefited. I mean, I'm not saying he didn't make good plays, but let's be honest. He is more comparable to a guy in Mac Jones who had so many tools around him, and I would even say Mac Jones is better because
more accurate.
You see the translation to the NFL. I think you look at that. I know Mac Jones hasn't been great, but Stetson Bennett has been completely terrible. So I think he was really beneficial of Kurre starts coaching and the players around him. So I don't get why he's so high. I get what happened. I get he's a 2-time national champion, but then again, you can go back to some other quarterbacks and say, okay, they were 2-time national champions, and they weren't good either. So they shouldn't make the list, and neither should Stetson Bennett.
Who'd you have over somebody like Stetson Bennett?
Let's see. Let me go down the list here. Let's see. I mean, Kyle Trask, number 1. I think that's a good person to mention. Will Rogers was awful, but I think he did more at Mississippi State than Stetson did at times at Georgia. If you take out the last season he had at Mississippi State, probably. Kellen Mond is a big one. I think he competed well.
Every year he's going to break out. Win the Heisman.
I mean, he had good years. He improved steadily every single year, especially his final year. And I know this goes off of really team success too. And Texas A&M struggled to have team success at times. But I think Kellen Mond deserves a mention. And then another big one, Drew Lock. Right after the 2017 season, I think it was kind of a fall off, and then it was like kind of bouncing around. Wasn't really super consistent at times, and really struggled his senior year. But I think he is a better quarterback than Stetson Bennett ever was, so he deserves to make the list in some form or fashion. And then part of this needs to be renumbered. Like
You're a
I
fan of
think
putting Tua behind Jaden Daniels?
I can see both sides of the argument. I think Tua was a better quarterback than Jalen Daniels. But Jalen Daniels also won a Heisman, and I think you
Yeah.
have to acknowledge that. But I also think Tua should have won a Heisman over Kyler Murray 2018 season. Um, so I think you look at Tua and what he did for Alabama, and then you look at Jaden Daniels and what he did for LSU, and you kind of weigh them out, and it's like, okay, well, Tua was kind of the better quarterback, and really, I think he should be above Jalen. Then, I mean, let's be honest, it's a neck and neck race.
Yeah.
And my Bama bias has put Tua ahead, but you can just be different about that. I think Bryce Young, if we're being consistent, because we've talked about consistency with these lists.
Yes.
If
Yes,
we're
we have.
putting Heisman winners higher, Bryce Young should be higher on the list because he
Above
did.
Dak.
He definitely, yeah, exactly. He won a Heisman. And if we're going off that too, Mac Jones would also be higher on this list because he finished third in the Heisman race and really had a really good argument to win it, even though we know he benefited from one of the greatest teams of all time, being around him. I mean, you look at his junior season before he got drafted, 4,500 passing yards, 41 passing touchdowns, only 4 interceptions. It really just wasn't fair, and that's the crazy thing. And then you go into the NFL. I mean, that's a whole different. Like these lists, I think this one's not completely terrible. I mean, I see where Roman Harper was going at some points. But just the consistency with award winning would probably be another one.
Yeah.
But it's not bad. But get Stetson Bennett out of there. He doesn't deserve to be in there.
I would have Bryce Young above Dak Prescott. The way Bryce Young slung that rock, I mean, holy smokes, man, you blow your socks off. Seeing him live
Yeah.
the times we did. And I know Dak Prescott was really good, and he was good watching him live in Mississippi State with Dan Mullen. But Bryce Young, if he didn't have Bill O'Brien and his offensive coordinator and Jamison Williams and John Mechie didn't get hurt, he would have 2 national championships under his belt. One as a starter. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yep.
Do you think Jalen Hurts should be up on this list at 7, Nathan, considering his best season happened at Oklahoma rather than at Alabama? I know Oklahoma's an ACC now, but they weren't back then.
I truly believe he deserves to be on this list. And we can talk about the Oklahoma season because it was really good and he was developed really, really well. And I think he was on the verge of breaking out at Alabama, but there happened to be 2 great quarterbacks on the same roster. I mean, they're
3 if
both
you
on this
include Mac
list.
Jones.
Yeah, exactly. You can keep making arguments for it, but Jalen Hurts at the time, especially his first few seasons as a freshman, he led Alabama to a national championship. He was like 26-2 as a starter in his first like 2 seasons. He was doing historic things, and this was really before passing quarterbacks were super popular everywhere. This was when we saw this transition to really opening up the offense. And this is, I mean, when the Big 12 was ahead of its time in the offensive department because they had already put in the spread offense and just absolutely torched defenses because of how modernized the offense was. But the SEC and Nick Saban really were still running a offense where it was methodical, run the ball, pass when you need to. And Jalen Hurts put up really, really good numbers within that offense. And I think you have to give him credit for that. And for the fact that he was able to get Alabama to 2 different national championships. I understand what happened. I understand he got benched in the second one, and Tua came in and sold the job for him, but he got the team there. And the same thing in the first season he started as a freshman, he carried the team to play against Clemson in the national championship. One play goes different. He's a national championship winner as a true freshman, and that would have been a historic thing at Alabama. No one would have done that. So there's a lot you can argue for Jalen Hurts to be on this list, even though his best season was at Oklahoma.
You can't forget about the season he came in for injured Tua and won that game against Georgia. That was big.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
he might have not started his final season, but when he came in, he played up to what he needed to be, and he won the games he needed to win. for the most part. And I think one person you didn't mention, Nathan, would be the Mississippi State quarterback, Nick Fitzgerald. I know he wasn't the greatest passer in the world, but he is the career rushing yards leader at quarterback in the SEC and fourth in career rushing touchdowns. And if you're going to put a guy like Dak Prescott on this list, who was good at Mississippi State, had a really, really good record winning wise, but somebody like Nick Fitzgerald, I think deserved to have a mention on this list. I think you might have the conversation to put him over a guy like Hendon Hooker, who didn't. I mean, Hendon Hooker, I know he tore his ACL in his final season, and he might have won the Heisman if he didn't do so. But Nick Fitzgerald, I mean, the records he holds and what he did in Mississippi State following Dak, I think can't be ignored. But it really just depends on what you're looking for on this list, whether it's consistency, records, awards, like what you're looking for. And I think if I was to make this list, I would probably have Nick Fitzgerald at 10 and have Hendon Hooker off my list, just based on what Fitzgerald did at Mississippi State and the records he holds and all he did there.
Yeah, I don't know if I could do that, only because his passing was terrible and he turned the ball over a numerous amount of times. I get what he did running the ball, but there was a lack of the quarterback for him.
I mean, it's each his own at this point making these kind of lists, but you just got to make sure you're consistent when you make them, because as we've seen with the Chris Doering's list and a couple other lists we've gone through, there's a lack of consistency in these lists sometimes.
Yeah, but this one's better. This one was actually like there's thought behind it. I could see where people, I mean, Ronan Harper was going with making this list.
Yeah, there was like a direction you were heading. You look north and you hit that road. You weren't like Chris Doering and we're taking all these detours left and right. So talking about the other list that Harper released, it was the top 10 SEC running backs of the last decade. No surprise, number 1 is Derrick Henry, 2 Nick Chubb, 3 Najee Harris, 4 Leonard Fournette, 5 Quinshon Judkins, 6 Benny Snell Jr., 7 Isaiah Spiller, 8 Kerryon Johnson, 9 Alex Collins, and then 10 Ralph Webb. Nathan, I asked the same question I asked with the quarterback list. At what point did I lose you going through the list?
I think Quinshon Judkins being that high at 5, even, I mean, he hasn't even finished his college career yet, and we're already putting him at 5 on this list, and he hasn't really done enough to prove that he is the 5th best running back in this decade. I mean, he's had great seasons. Really I think he's really good. I don't think he should belong on this list yet. I think you have to wait for a guy to finish his college career to be put on this list. And I mean, I'm not saying that he's not going to end up on this list. I think you got to give it time. And there are probably several running backs in the waiting that should be on this list that we're going to talk about here in a second.
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and hit that point right there, Nathan. What running backs are missing on this list?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that Sonny Michel is not on this list. The 1-2 punch from the Georgia running backs. You had Nick Chubb on there, rightfully so. Sonny Michel did a lot at times, but his carries being taken away by Nick Chubb really hurts him on this list. And if you're looking at the consistency here, if you're looking at the amount of yards put up, he's missing some of the stats and awards to go on this list. And I think you mentioned Damien Harris on this list. He's missing the stats to back him up, even though he was a 2-time national championship winner and he did a lot for Alabama at the time. He didn't really have the stats to back him up. DeAndre Swift was fantastic. He was pretty consistent. He had 2,000-yard seasons. He just missed out on awards. Josh Jacobs was good, but he never rushed for 1,000 yards in the season at Bama, so I can't really put him on that list. Alvin Kamara was great, but on both ends, receiving and rushing, but doesn't have the stats, doesn't have the awards. If I'm trying to sneak a guy in this list, I think I'm looking at DeAndre Swift probably. I think he has really good stats, and I mean he proved a lot his time in Georgia, and especially transitioning to the NFL. I think he deserves to be somewhere on this list. And then you can argue guys like Damien Harris and Sonny Michel, Travion Williams, I didn't even talk about, but he was good at Texas A&M. a lot of great running backs in the SEC. But for me, I don't know if I would go ahead and pick Quinshon Judkins on this list until he finishes his college career. And speaking of that, he's not in the SEC anymore. So he's a great running back. What can I say?
If I would have put another person on this list to replace, let's say, a Quinshon Judkins or an Alex Collins or Kerryon Johnson, whoever you want to say, doesn't deserve to be on the list, I would have put Sony Michel on it. 1,000-yard seasons, and that's pretty outstanding considering he had to compete with carries with Nick Chubb, of all people, who's second on this list. So to have Nick Chubb and Sony Michel on this list is pretty wild for me. And then you have Jake Fromm on the quarterbacks list. So the fact that that team didn't win a national championship is crazy. That's to have two of the greatest running backs of the last decade. And whatever you want to say about Jake Fromm, he's probably one of the best quarterbacks of the last decade. And not win a national championship is just crazy. Just ran to the Alabama buzzsaw, I guess, is what you want to say. But I think I would sneak, I would sneak Sony Michel on to the list, just how dominant he was.
Yeah, how did you feel about Najee Harris being above Leonard Fournette? A lot of people had a issue with that. I don't as much, just because of how crazy Najee Harris was. I mean, he came fifth in Heisman voting. And really, you could have made a good argument. You talk about the impact he had. And I know Leonard Fournette was right there to win the Heisman before Alabama shut him down. He had fantastic stats, but I kind of look at what Najee did, not only on running the ball, but also in the receiving game. I was playing like that receiving back style at times, and he was more effective and I think you look back to the 2020 Alabama team and why that team was so effective. It's because Najee Harris could run the ball, but then when we went empty, Najee Harris could catch the ball and he could take it to the house whenever he wanted. So I think he has that upside over Leonard Fournette. But I also don't want to ignore how fantastic Leonard Fournette was, because he just tore through defenses and gashed people. But I think Najee Harris was a little bit better in the fact that he made more of an impact.
So we've kind of talked about it with Roman Harper's QB list and the running back list. It appears he's sort of leaning towards favoring award winners, and Najee Harris won the Doak Walker and Leonard Fournette didn't. Granted, Leonard Fournette was having to go against Derrick Henry to win the Doak Walker Award in 2015. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of leeway there for Leonard Fournette, but you kind of pointed out there, Nathan, Najee's ability to have an effect in the passing game was much more than Leonard Fournette's was and ever was in his career at LSU. I know he did a lot better in NFL. We're talking about college football right now. And if Leonard Fournette did not run into the Alabama buzzsaw, Nick Saban buzzsaw, kind of like Georgia did in 2015, we probably would be saying Leonard Fournette's the Heisman winner, but he ran into that buzzsaw and Alabama did not. That game is historic. The amount of negative yards Leonard Fournette got. I mean, that performance is probably top 5 all time against the team, in my opinion. I have to watch that game.
That's the game he lost the Heisman.
Yeah, I have to watch that game every year just to see how dominant Bama was and the game plan Kirby and Nick had for the Heisman leader right there, Leonard Fournette. But I can see where people are coming from Fournette. Almost had 2,000 rushing yards. Was very dominant in 2015. Najee was sort of off and on. He didn't have over 1,500 rushing yards in his career, but the dominance he played with, winning the Doak Walker and 2-time national champion, I think you have to give it to Najee here just to have consistency with favoriting players with their award winning and all that type of stuff. But I can see arguments either way. It's just I see Najee Harris as being better than Leonard Fournette was for a longer period of time. Leonard Fournette after 2015 sort of tapered off. I know he dealt with injuries, but still.
Is there anyone on this list that kind of jumps out to you? Like, why are they on the list? Or you can kind of see why they should be, but you would move someone else in over them?
Isaiah Spiller. I don't know why he's at number 7. If Gray was here and he saw Kerryon Johnson below Isaiah Spiller, he would probably freak out because Kerryon Johnson carried 2017 Auburn, and had he not got injured against Alabama, they probably would have gone to the national championship game. There's a high probability they would have. Kerryon Johnson carried that team, and Gray would agree that it would have been a masterful season for Kerryon. So I think to have him below a guy like Isaiah Spiller, who had 2,000-yard seasons, I just didn't see an impact Isaiah Spiller had on the field as much as somebody like Kerryon Johnson did for Auburn or somebody like Sony Michel did for Georgia. I know he spelled Nick Chubb and they sort of shared that backfield, but I would have Sony Michel over a guy like Isaiah Spiller, and I have Kerryon Johnson over Isaiah Spiller, and I would have Ralph Webb over Isaiah Spiller. So I don't think Isaiah Spiller deserved a spot on this list. I mean, he didn't win awards either, but this is the one time I don't see where Roman Harper's going with the list is Isaiah Spiller at 7.
Yeah. And I would make an argument for Alex Collins to be higher on this list. He had 3,000-yard seasons. He really led Arkansas through 2013, 2014, 2015. He was just absolutely crazy. Made one of the most influential plays in my lifetime and sent Alabama to the SEC championship by beating Ole Miss on a 4th and 25. And, Alex Collins, rest in peace. Because not only did I get to watch him play at Arkansas, I got to watch him play in the USFL, and he was crazy in the USFL too. So I think you look at stats, he has stats to back him up. I mean, he was a insanely good running back, and I think that you look at the team success at Arkansas, and immediately you just like, okay, well, Alex Collins doesn't deserve to be higher on this list because his team didn't benefit from his success. And I don't think you look at that. I mean, look, Ralph Webb is on this list, and Vanderbilt didn't have the type of success that they should have with him on the roster. But does he deserve to be higher? Yes. I mean, he almost had 4,000-yard seasons, and that's something to give him credit for. But both those guys, I think, should be higher. Isaiah Spiller, if he was on this list at all, I think he should be at 10.
Yes.
I would put Kerryon at 7. Alex Collins at 8, Ralph Webb at 9, and then probably putting Isaiah Spiller at 10. If not, finding someone else, probably Sony Michel, like you
I put Sony
mentioned.
Michel.
Yeah, to take a spot, or a guy like DeAndre Swift. I mean, I wouldn't be mad about that. I like Benny Snell being at 6. I feel like that's a really good spot for him. He had historic stats at Kentucky, and he was that one player you constantly mention with Kentucky. I mean, it was pretty much symbolic at that point that Benny Snell was Kentucky whenever they had a game. I don't know, just having Quinton Judkins on this list at 5 just throws me off a little bit just because his college career is not done yet, and the fact that he transferred away from Ole Miss. But in the 2 seasons he had at Ole Miss, he put up some really great stats, especially the amount of times he scored. I just it's kind of that situation where Ole Miss didn't have the type of team success that they should have with him at running back. But then again, you look at it and it's like he was a freshman and a sophomore in these 2 seasons, and he put up those type of stats, and that was crazy. And if he would have continued to stay at Ole Miss, I think he would have, had an argument to keep finishing higher on this list, but he wanted to go ahead and go to Ohio State for some reason.
Yeah, that was a puzzling thing for me is go to Ohio State when you're going to be competing with Travion Henderson at running back, who arguably it was a better running back prospect than Judkins was going into the next year's draft. So that was a bit puzzling for me when you leave a team where you're back-to-back 1,000-yard rushers, back-to-back 15-plus touchdowns. And the only time that's ever happened is with Herschel Walker outside of Quinton Judkins in their first 2 seasons. So I think Judkins is accurately placed on this list at 5, just with the records he holds and being an all-SEC first team as a freshman. But as you mentioned, Nathan, him leaving the SEC, I can see your argument. We're moving him down the list or maybe not having him on the list at all. But I think what he did in his 2 seasons at Ole Miss, being so historic and so great, I think you can't not have him on this list. You have to have him at least I think he has to be at least top 6. You can have Benny Snell over if you want to, but for me, I think 5 is perfect for him. I would not have him any higher. You cannot put him over Leonard Fournette. You cannot put him over Najee Harris, and you sure cannot put him over Nick Chubb or Derrick Henry. There's no way.
Yeah, no one would ever pass Derrick Henry. I don't think anyone in the right mind would put anyone over Derrick Henry. And honestly, he has an argument to be one of the best college running backs ever. I know there's a lot of other guys you have to mention in the conversation with Herschel Walker and Bo Jackson and keep going down the list. But Derrick Henry in his 2015 season was a armored tank running through a bunch of kids. That's what it was every single game. He had 200-yard games, and he would just run the ball down your throat and make you want to quit. And He did. 2015, people quit.
Makes me quit on Madden.
Yeah, that and the fact that at the time Alabama had no passing identity. I love Jake Coker, but let's be honest, the only time passing was opened up was in the national championship game when OJ Howard was left wide open 3 different times. Because I mean we didn't pass the ball that much against Michigan State. Trying to remember the SEC championship that year. Gosh, who it wasn't Georgia.
Was it not Florida?
It wasn't Florida. I think it was Florida that year. We definitely didn't pass the ball against Florida because I mean we were running the ball. It was a whole season of running the ball, and he was a whole identity of the team. And
yes, it was Florida. 29-15 was the final score.
Okay, yeah, I remember that game. That was the game where Alabama opened up by they let up a few points, but Minka Fitzpatrick had a pick 6, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. That's
Best
how
college
well
safety of all time.
Yeah, we should have one of those lists. But Derrick Henry was a whole identity of Alabama, and you knew. The thing was, people know what was coming. You knew he was going to get the ball, but there's nothing you can do about it. He was just going to run through you, and he did that time and time again, and that's the reason why he is number 1 on this list, and why he is one of the best college running backs of all time, if not one of the greatest running backs of all time, given the fact that he has put up historic stats in the NFL. He was, man. If you would have told me back in 2015 Derrick Henry was going to be this good, I don't know. I mean, it's been a real treat to watch him in not only his college career but his NFL career.
It definitely has been. I'm not a fan of playing against him in Madden, like I said, but watching him play live and just the progression he's played in since that Oklahoma bowl game when he was basically the only person on the team trying. I mean, that was the welcome to Derrick Henry right there. That game, even though he lost the game, we saw what Derrick Henry was going to be, and that was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get out of here, Nathan, do you think that Georgia and Alabama running backs sort of took a hit because they had to share the backfield a lot of the time? You talk about Josh Jacobs, Damian Harris, Sonny Michel. I mean, the list goes on and on. Bo Scarborough. I mean, that we didn't even talk about Bo Scarborough, but is that an issue with these kind of running backs? Is they had to share the backfield and didn't get the love they needed to be put on this list stat wise? But if you were ranked them talent wise, might be on a list like this.
Yeah, no, that argument can definitely be made. You look at the style of offense that most of these running backs were in at the time. It was a running back cut by committee scenario where, I mean, you had a guy who got majority of the stats, but the amount of times that there were substitutions, I mean, you would go deep on your roster, even going to the 3rd or 4th running back on your roster and putting them in the game to run the ball. And because that's just how effective running was at the time, because you had some of the best offensive lines that you'd ever seen who could run block, I mean, insanely well. So I think you talk about a guy like Bo Scarborough, who was very influential, but just didn't have the stats back him up, or Damian Harris, who was able to just run through defenses half the time, but he was having to share carries with Najee Harris at times. And then same thing for a guy like Sonny Michel. Like if he played his own season and had the type of carries that Nick Chubb had, or any running back on this list who was the primary back, then Sonny Michel's stats are going to be way, way better given that scenario. But, I mean, this is all hypothetical. I mean, different things could happen. Injuries happen. But, yeah, it's a good argument to make, especially with how talented people are. I mean, Josh Jacobs is one of the best running backs in the NFL right now. I mean, he was a rushing leader a few years ago in the NFL, and he just didn't have any really great stats to back him up. But then again, it was a running back by committee, and he had to share the rock a lot. And by the time you realize what Josh Jacobs was, he's already going to the NFL.
Yeah, 2018 Josh Jacobs was pretty insane.
Mm-hmm.
Well, next week we'll be back with college football scores, going over what happened in those games, probably focusing a little bit in on Georgia Tech and Florida State, because that's the marquee matchup this weekend. So we'll be back discussing that and delving into the matchups going into next weekend. So appreciate everyone for watching. Thank you. We'll be back next week.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio.